Well, thanks for joining again, Laurie. It's great to be here. We'll keep working our way through John. We're starting chapter 1. So I wanted to start off today just reflecting a bit on last week. So we ended our discussion last week looking at Jesus calling of first disciples. And we have that picture where the couple of disciples, they meet Jesus and then they go and spend the rest of the day with him. And he just, I suppose, hangs out with them is how we'd sort of put it in modern terms. What do you think? I'm just thinking about sort of the idea there of friendship at the heart of what Jesus is doing sort of with people, that it seems being alongside people and being friends with them and just enjoying being around them. I don't know, we don't have much evidence of that, but just that there's an element of friendship there, and that's something that I know later in the Gospel of John, Jesus talks about how he no longer calls them disciples, but calls them friends. What do you think about that sort of place of friendship there at the heart of what Jesus is doing in forming a group around him?
Well, going back to that incident, the initial interest from the disciples who followed Jesus was when they heard the Baptist kind of meditating and saying, "There goes the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world," and speaks about how John the Baptist tells how he had a special revelation from God to tell him that the Messiah who was to come to Israel was going to be shown to John by the Spirit of God descending like a dove upon him, and the sort of things that happened when Jesus got baptized. So John was meditating on the importance of Jesus, I suppose, or that the Messiah would have been the most important person in the whole of the history of Israel, and its revelation, the revelation that was given to it by God. So, I'm thinking those disciples would have recognized the greatness of who this man was, but what they saw wasn't some victorious king coming with an army of angels to rescue Israel out of the enemy, the Romans' subjection. So hard to tell. We haven't got enough information to say exactly what attracted them, but there was something there in that they were spiritually alive because they had come to John the Baptist and listened to him, and then they'd heard from John the Baptist something about the significance of Jesus, something pretty special. And I suppose there's a lot of curiosity, but that he was just an ordinary bloke, I think that must have been some kind of a surprise to them. And the thing that stands out for me is that they were interested enough, and is courageous the right word, just to go ahead and say, okay, I want to find out what this is all about. And they did. And then Jesus' response to them was not in keeping with him being the Messiah that they expected on a white horse coming in to deliver them from the Romans, but he was just an ordinary bloke and responded to them, what do you want? And they must have been taken aback, because you can almost see the friendship developing there. Respect is a big part of it, but then there's also the openness and friendliness, just plain friendliness, I think, of Jesus. And I don't think they ever lost their respect. There was too much going on, the things that Jesus said and did, but they were drawn in closer and closer to his natural kind of relationship with them. And I guess that's at the core of friendship. There has to be respect, and then something natural that works between human beings.
Yes, I was just thinking about that idea of of Jesus finding a small group of people who are committed as the core of his strategy. Any thoughts on that?
Well, so obvious. Each of the synoptics and John as well, I think, point out that he chose the 12. And that was a very strategic move, like symbolic as well, in that 12 was representative of the 12 tribes of Israel, that he was fully aware that he was setting up a new company to be the representatives of God on earth. Israel had been that for the last 12, 14, well, 1800 years before the time of Christ, for the call of Abraham to be father of the special people. But yeah, it's so obvious that Jesus is seeing the full scope of his ministry to be replacing Israel as the with a body of people that God was going to use as he had wanted to use Israel in the past. That doesn't mean to say that Israel doesn't have a future. They still are, like it says in Romans chapter 11, that they're still God's people, and God is still keeping the promises that he made to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so there's still a future place for Israel in God's plan. But by bringing Christ into the world, the coming of the Messiah, the birth of Jesus, this is the fulfillment of that part of the old covenant. And Jesus is deliberately setting out to build this replacement for Israel, or the new covenant, really. And that's why it's called the New Testament, the New Covenant, that represents what Jesus did by calling, first of all, that group, and then through them sending out the message to the rest of the world to hear the gospel and respond, and to join that new company, the Church of Jesus Christ. Yeah, so no, he was very, very deliberate, and he started off where every real thing has to start. It starts with the first step. And they probably didn't look very impressive. Well, they certainly didn't, because they were rejected by Israel. But now it's what it is in the world right now, the Church of Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, so at the start, it seems like in sort of the flow of the story in John, that you start off with the prologue, and then the introduction to John the Baptist and his story. And then there's these really short but positive stories about the first disciples responding in a way that kind of captures what he's set up in the prologue, that they're people who are, they seem to believe in Jesus and they want to be with him. And there's a sense where this is the future of that new sort of picture. We have, after Jesus meets Andrew and John, he then meets Peter, and he gives Peter a new name, which we talked a little bit about last week. And then he heads up to Galilee, where he meets Philip along the way, and then Philip finds Nathanael. And then Jesus has sort of that interesting interaction with Nathanael, where he says to him, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip spoke to you." And Jesus says to him that he's an Israelite worthy of the name. There is nothing false in him. What's the significance, do you think, of that sort of in this section that John's recording here?
All the way along, John is remember his goal. At the end of the book, he says he wants to convince us that Jesus is the Messiah and that he's the Son of God, so that by believing through his name, we might have the new kind of life that comes with sharing in that life of God. So yeah, the stories that John chose show progressively, I think, the power of Jesus. And this is right at the very beginning. In chapter 2, it moves on to tell the story of the changing of the water into wine. as the first miracle that Jesus performed. But this is before that, and I think John shows how Jesus startled those early disciples, by the unique powers he had, not as God, but as a human being with God's Spirit on him and called to a particular ministry. Yeah.
So do you think Jesus, in sort of identifying those qualities in Nathaniel, do you think it was just him observing Nathaniel with the power of the Holy Spirit? Or did he have some sort of extra insight into knowing, oh, this is a true son of Israel? Or he could just tell by his posture and that sort of thing?
Don't you wish you knew what Philip was up to, Nathaniel was up to under the fig tree? Must have been, there must have been something that in Nathaniel's spirit was going on that was really deep and was touching, beyond the ordinary. It wasn't just praying for his chickens to lay more eggs and that sort of thing, but it was a deep kind of reaching out from Nathaniel to touch the heart of God, and really wanting to be honest and open and God's person. This has been my imagination, of course, but I picture something like that happening, which it has to set up a spiritual energy. And I think Jesus, as a man, was able to sense that spiritual energy, even if he didn't see it with his eyesight. That's my take on it. A little bit fanciful, but I rather think that we call things intuition. We don't really know what they mean. That something goes on deeper than what we're maybe that familiar with, extraordinary. And I think there was that going on with Jesus all the time, and that it was in Nathaniel at that moment, and Jesus had somehow sensed it. And when Nathaniel turned up, he recognized, here is this this focus of real intentionality in coming into the presence of God, and as one of his creatures expressing, the kind of desire for authenticity and reality, and the kind of things that real prayer reaches out for. Yeah. So in my imagination, I can imagine this as being something that isn't Jesus calling upon his divine powers, because he, like Paul said later on, he gave up his divine powers and emptied himself in order to become a human being. So I think this is something that is probably within the capabilities of human beings, but rarely practiced. We've lost so much of our spiritual powers because of sin, focusing on ourselves instead of on God. And here's an example of a man who was throwing that aside, Nathaniel. And I think Jesus, as a man, sensing it, recognizing it, and affirming it to Nathaniel when Nathaniel turned up. It certainly knocked Nathaniel out of the saddle. His skepticism departed pretty quickly, and he then begins to call Jesus, chosen one of God, giving Jesus all the titles that he could think of being God's answer to the world's need.
Yeah, that's right. He sort of goes right to the top, doesn't he, in his evaluation of Jesus then?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, that sort of leads me to think, what you've sort of been involved in a couple of movements, like with working for Campus Crusade over in England, and then starting off Cornerstone. What sort of that picture that you just sort of presented there of sort of having an insight into people and drawing people and finding people who are sort of filled with that sort of passion, what sort of part did that play in those sort of things that you were part of setting up?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had experiences like, I remember one time, this is back here in Australia, just before we set up Cornerstone, and I was at a youth camp with maybe, oh no, 60, 70 young people, and one of whom I knew already, having met him before, a fine young bloke, and I was really drawn to him. I challenged him severely about his moral life, and he'd responded, and he was at the camp, and it was a discussion time. I was in front of the group of young people, and the discussion moved generally, not specifically, and to the topic where I had communicated previously with this young fellow, and all of a sudden he just burst out and said, "Laurie, don't say anything more," because he had this sense that what we were talking about was something that he was in tune with and I was in tune with, and that was just something too much for him to bear at the moment. And yeah, there you go. He didn't become a disciple of Cornerstone, actually. Last I heard about him, he was involved in a fairly mild criminal pursuit in the United States of America.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, just to say, yeah, I've sensed that kind of feeling of some sort of a spiritual tuning in with people, and that certainly, like with Paul Rowe, for example. I remember when Alveda and I met Paul, and we talked together briefly. I think I said to, I know I did. I said to Alveda, that bloke would make a really good disciple. We should try and get to know him and Robin very well, which happened, of course, and he became co-founder of Cornerstone with me. But as far as starting Cornerstone for me and being involved in Campus Crusade, it wasn't so much a deep spiritual insight or any kind of sense of calling that was other than just a rational response to the truth that I had become convinced was the way the world is, and that if you had any sense at all, you would try to obey what Jesus told the disciples way back then, to go and make disciples. And so it was just an effort to do that, to think through what that would involve, and then to set up some practical way of making it happen. I know that doesn't sound very spiritual. I remember at the time I was in Burke, and I went around the ministers of the churches and described there was only three, I think. Anyway, in talking to them, it was they were a little bit surprised, but I thought, well, fair enough. This is the way I am, and this is what I think. And so talked about this as an idea, and every one of them was really they didn't think it was a good idea, basically. The most spiritual of them said that I should put out a fleece like Gideon did to work out whether this was actually God's will or not. And the Catholic bloke said, well, you're a Protestant, so it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't make much difference. Yeah, it was just, I was trying to get as a sort of a perspective on it from as broad a base as I could, but I still came back to, well, the story of the Bible is clear as anything. God's revealed himself. He's called people to follow him and to make that the priority in their lives, and to try and help others to find the same faith. and to just do it.
Yep, it's a simple kind of response. So right at the end of that section, Jesus says something pretty enigmatic there, where he adds, after talking to Nathanael, "In truth, in very truth, I tell you, you shall see heaven wide open and God's angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." What do we make of that, the imagery that's going on in there and what Jesus is saying?
Well, he's obviously alluding back to Jacob's dream, where Jacob had that dream that saw the ladder going up to heaven and the angels coming up and down. And I guess what Jesus actually said is, you ain't seen nothing yet. What Jacob dreamed, you're seeing the reality. You're not just seeing angels going up and down to visit God. You're seeing God's already come down here, right here before you. Once you grasp that, you'll realize that what Jacob saw is absolutely nothing. And then, of course, he was pointing forward to all the things that they were going to see as his life with them evolved, and they saw the miracles that he did and heard the things that he claimed. I think what it's saying is God's revelation is like the link between heaven and earth isn't that, that big a deal. It's part of just the natural state of things. There is a God, there is a heaven, there is this creation that we're part of, and they're not, so different and so distant from one another that it's a unique thing. I think every one of us, could be an accident, could be we in an instant could be taken from earth to heaven as quickly as that, or from earth into the spiritual dimension of life. And I think he's saying that there, that the link between heaven and earth is just something that isn't such a barrier as you think, and that if you only tune yourself in, heaven becomes part of earth here and now, and earth becomes part of heaven.
Yeah. So he's pulling back the veil for us, and it's not far from any one of us.
Yeah. And that's why I think our old cornerstone motto is so relevant, that we should make the effort so that we make our natural life spiritual and our spiritual life natural, because that's what was happening right there and then. The coming of God into the world was natural in their experience right at that moment as they looked on Jesus and listened to him. They were communicating with God full on.
Yeah, and it made a tremendous difference to their whole world and their whole trajectory of their lives, obviously.
Yeah.
So straight after that, we get into the story of Jesus. Says 3 days later, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. Jesus heads off there. His mother's there. There's a bunch of guests there. The wine runs out, and then Jesus' mother says to him, "You can help." He says, "Woman, it's not yet my time." And Jesus helps anyway and changes the water into the wine and says, "This is the first of the signs." What's the significance of this first sign?
I've puzzled about that too. Obviously, John is very, very careful in choosing, out of all that he had available, the particular incidents in Jesus' life that he wanted. Only thing I can think of is that this was the first time when Jesus showed his supernatural power. But when he was baptized and the Spirit came down like a dove and a voice from heaven, that was a supernatural thing that happened to verify that Jesus was the Messiah when John the Baptist baptized him. But this is just the first thing that Jesus did that was beyond ordinary explanation. He had done in a minute what it takes year of grapes growing and then however many years of grapes fermenting in order to make wine. And Jesus had done it just like that. Uh, it probably stuck in John's mind because it was the first time that he saw, and like the significance of the signs is that they lead people to believe who Jesus is. And this was the first little step, like jumping off a spaceship onto the surface of the moon. First little step, but it was so gigantic that a new thing was happening. God was working in the world through a person doing stuff that normally in the natural course of things takes ages, days, years.
It's interesting that the sort of the ones who would have known most clearly what had happened weren't the household would have found out about it eventually, but were the servants.
Exactly.
And the ones who had more of a humble role in the whole thing. And they're the ones who got to witness it and then probably told other people about it. So it's like this, he's starting off this new thing, but he's willing for it to start off in a small way where it's just probably advanced through rumor and that sort of thing, and not so much by something that's way out there right from the start.
I'm thinking, most of the people who talk to the servants who delivered the new wine out of the water urns, whatever they were, they wouldn't have believed them.
Yeah, that's right.
Probably wouldn't. And probably the only one who believed him was Mary.
Yeah, that's right. So I suppose the question I always have about that is why, firstly, why does Jesus just say it's not yet my time, but then he just goes and does it anyway?
I guess that's put that down to his humanity. Mothers have an awful influence over their kids. I came back from over in Europe because my mother wrote a letter and said, we need help back here on the farm.
Yep. And so
always intended to go back and never did.
Back to Europe.
Back to Europe, yeah.
So you're glad you never did?
Well, this was back in the days of the Iron Curtain, and they wanted me to lead Campus Crusade. I was one of the candidates for being sent behind the Iron Curtain to set up Campus Crusade ministries on universities in Russia.
Yep.
Might not have survived.
No.
You don't question it. You just take it and move forward.
Yeah.
But no, maybe that's why Jesus didn't make it into such a spectacular thing. He didn't feel that it was quite his time yet, but for his mother's sake, and she may well have been sort of part of the family, part of the bridal arrangements, and so for his sake, he did this, and John, being there, picked it up.
Yeah, well, it's going to create a pretty deep imprint onto his disciples who've just started following him to experience that. It's pretty memorable, and they're going to be thinking, right, I mean, Nathaniel's made that declaration, surely you are the Son of God, but here they are at a wedding and Jesus turns water into wine. You think, oh, maybe this really is what we think it is.
It is. It's very private. It's private, perhaps not the right word, but it's personal. Personal. That's the word I was looking for. That the disciples are being let in onto who Jesus is by being kind of there while he's responding to his mother and using his ability to do a spectacular thing like making something like around about 70 gallons of wine.
Yeah. So what do we take away from that? How does that shape us as disciples of Jesus now, 2,000 years later? We look at that story and think, what do we do with it?
Well, I think one of the themes in John is truth has been revealed, and it's being witnessed to. Uh, that was a witness to the truth that God had become a human being, that Jesus was this somehow more than human. And I think we need to take uh, that to heart, that just how natural it should be for us to be aware of the power that God has invested in human beings who are, well, invested first and foremost in Jesus, Son of God and Son of Man, but also in us as human beings made in his image, but now introduced into the life of God through Jesus Christ, that we should take it. There's a wrong way of taking things for granted, but there's a right way of taking things for granted too. That we should adjust our lives so that we're comfortable with the fact that God is part of ordinary life and involved in ordinary things, and that there's a spectacular side to it in that it's God doing this, and yeah, to feel comfortable with it and to build it into our lives as an outlook, a way of being.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I get a sense in that story too where, God's able to do something, Jesus is able to do something where it looks like it's going to be a disaster and, the greatest kind of shame for the family, but something extraordinary happens. And I think that sort of story is worked out over and over again in the
Absolutely.
Gospels, but it's also worked out over and over again in our own lives as we kind of struggle with disappointment and we struggle with things going wrong and not being the way we think they could be. But there, when we exercise that simple faith and belief and work at that God is able to bring, results that we may not ever have imagined or expected.
Yeah. And also part of it is overcoming our own determination to get our own way and being prepared to let God have his way.
That's true. But sometimes you might want to be a bit like Mary, who pushes things on a bit.
Yeah. Well, we've got family privileges.
Yeah, maybe there's some space to do that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that is a really good point. That, I suppose, at the heart of who we are is so often we want things just to work out the way we want them to work out, and we don't actually know what's the best for us.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we do know what's the best for us. If God loves us like God loves us, then what he wants for us is the best for us.
Yeah,
It's just recognizing it.
yeah, and that's where the story ends up heading forwards.
Yep.
You get to see that.
Yep.
All right, well, that's probably a good place to finish. Thanks again.
Excellent. Good talking. Pleasure.